everybody doing? Welcome back to our lesson streams. It's been quite a while since I've sat down with one of these lessons to talk with y'all about what we've been covering. Been busy traveling and therefore not able to put on these broadcasts. So, looking at my schedule, it looks like I have 5 lessons that I need to go over today. Probably not going to get through all of them. Probably going to get through 2 or 3, and then another 2 or 3 on Tuesday, and another 2 or 3 on the Friday. So, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm more than happy to go on tangents. I'm going to try and avoid going on tangents to future lessons, because we're going to get there eventually. But all of this is tied in, and sometimes philosophies and ideas from future lessons will be relevant to the current lesson. And so, of course, we'll go on tangents. But let's get started. Let's talk about penalties. Lesson 12. Penalties are an important part of infraction policy, but they are necessary, but I see them generally as a necessary evil. I don't want to use the term evil, but the phrase necessary evil is a common one. Penalties are there to further disincentivize players from malicious action and from quick distraction, brain goes places. So penalties are there to serve as disincentivization for malicious players, as well as to make sure that honest players don't keep on making mistakes. The idea of education through punishment is one that I think generally has shown not to work super well, particularly in the case of players making honest and genuine mistakes. It does sometimes encourage players who are sloppy players who are playing a little bit loose, is that one, it doesn't work as well. It can get them to tighten up a little bit, but punishing people doesn't really work. Anyways, quick tangent. Tennessee Pete Monk asks, can all the clarifications that you relay through the lessons be added to the policy clarification site? People are definitely being sideswiped by live Q&A clarifications and lesson clarifications that are not directly stated in the normal places. So this is something that I like to do, but it's also a little bit weird in that, I can write those clarifications, but it is strange for me to write those clarifications knowing that they are going to be overwritten soon, and they will be overwritten sooner if I don't write them, by simply assisting in writing the updated policy. I have limited bandwidth, and my options are either write temporary clarifications that will need to be revised, or write permanent longer-term updates. And I have been choosing to focus on the longer-term updates because I think that's better for the long-term health of the game. If folks follow policy as written and not the clarifications, yes, it does result in a less consistent game in the short term. And that's something that we generally want to avoid. However, a lot of the clarifications are also philosophical clarifications and not specific, this is exactly what you need to do. And so it's all part and parcel of something larger, and I think doing a half-assed version of it would be detrimental. But it's these clarifications are coming slower than I would like, but as fast as I can reasonably get them updated. And again, the priority is getting lessons out so that the educational content is there, and then updating the policy itself so that because so many people don't look at the clarifications. So many people don't look at the rules clarifications or the policy clarifications. And so while having them there is better than having them in the lessons, I would say that possibly even as small as the top 10% of most enfranchised judges, much less players, are aware of that. And so focusing on the fundamental official documents is better for the long-term health of the game. So maybe, but it's a priorities thing, and right now it's not something that's near the top of my priorities. So, let's back on penalties. Penalties come in a variety of formats. As the lesson says, they're the most punitive elements of our arsenal. And it's really important when you are issuing a penalty to be aware of the impact it can have on a player. When we issue warning penalties and you're like, here's a penalty point, it's nothing to worry about, we know that it's nothing to worry about. The player feels like they are about to be disqualified. Something that can help you as a judge and will help your investigations later on is when a player seems concerned about a ruling that you're giving, if you ask them what they expect the penalty to be, that'll let you understand what players are thinking as you get to matches. And that allows you to preemptively provide information to players to help mitigate that anxiety. A lot of players believe that pretty much any error can and will result in a game loss. And so this has two consequences. One is they don't call a judge because they don't want to get a game loss. And two, if they do call a judge or a judge is called on them, they are very nervous and uncomfortable because they believe that they're about to lose the game, and that's something that they want to avoid. That's on top of, I've made a mistake, I'm calling attention to it, and people don't like failing and don't like people bringing attention to their failures. And so having that be the focus of a conversation can be very unsettling for players. And so it's important to recognize how players will respond to penalties. I encourage all judges to play in competitive tier events. Call a judge when you make an error and see how you feel being investigated, particularly by a judge you don't know. Because if it's somebody that knows who you are, that's obviously going to be a different dynamic. But the experience that most players have is a stranger comes over and then judges them and the way that they're playing. And that's a very unsettling experience. And it's important to make sure that players are aware that a warning or even a game loss or a match loss isn't a condemnation of the player. And that we believe generally that they're an honest player. It wasn't malicious. We understand it was an accident. A lot of times I'll be like in the middle of giving a warning to a player or even a game loss, and they'll be like, this is unfair. Do you think I'm cheating or something? And my answer there is, if I thought you were cheating, we'd be having a very different conversation right now and be much more uncomfortable for you. We'd be talking about disqualification, not a warning or a game loss. This is just tracking. This is how we fix, like, we don't have a good remedy, and so we rely on a game loss, and we'll get into that later. But just be aware of how players will react to you issuing these penalties. Tennessee Feet Monk asks, is the new rewritten policy going to be live and available for the Galactic Championships? I don't know. It's our goal. We want it to be available by then, but policy does need to go through approvals process. Some of it, at minimum, the head judge team is going to have access to whatever is available as guidelines for philosophy so that the team can make consistent decisions at Galactics. And if there's anything significant that's different, we're going to pass that along to the judge staff. It's possible that what we will be doing is, for the Galactic Championship, have a draft of policy and say, this is not finalized, this is not official confirmed policy, but we do have it from FFG. This is what we're going to be using for this event, because the team I mean, so far at least 200 hours have been put into rewriting policy. There were 4 of us, sometimes 5 or 6 of us in a room for a week. And when I say in a room for a week, I mean that is what I did from walking into the office at the beginning of the day to walking out and on my lunch break, along with several members of the organized play team. And so a lot of time and thought and effort has already gone into it. More is going to be put into it over the coming weeks. And so while we're going to call it a draft, it's going to be very close to the final draft. And so there will be consistency for the Galactic Championship. It's something that we are aware of, and like members of the organized play team are going to be there. The folks who are writing this update, as well as me, who's helping write this document, we're all going to be there, and so we're going to be able to ensure that we have consistent policy. But back to penalties. So we have several different penalties available to us. We have penalty points, which include warnings, as I'll colloquially call them. We have game losses, match losses, and disqualifications. Penalty points are actually an area where we have wild inconsistency, because the way they're written is, depending on the judgment of the individual who is issuing the penalty, they can issue, particularly for gameplay disruptions, issue more points if they believe it is a more severe disruption. And there's absolutely no guidance on that. And so right now, penalty points have some fundamental flaws. And a player isn't going to know how many penalty points they're going to receive for a mistake, because one judge might be like, oh, yes, this is simple. We can relatively easily back this up. We're going to move back, play on. Whereas another judge might be like, I don't know how to fix this. This is very disruptive to the game state. We're going to do our best to fix it. We're going to maybe play on, here's a game loss, or here's 8 penalty points instead of 1 penalty point. But penalty points are there to effectively work as a warning for a player and as a tracking and upgrade system. Penalty systems, or infraction systems rather, need an upgrade path. Otherwise, malicious players and players who continually make errors don't have an incentive to change their behavior. If all we do is slap them on the wrist and say, don't do that again, and then the next time they do it, we say, hey, don't do that again. And the next time they do it, we say, hey, don't do that again. And the next time they do it, we say, hey, don't do that again. That's not useful. There's no incentive. I'm sure you've all been in systems where there are warnings without teeth. Like, you're told don't do that, and then you do it anyways. Or like, you've seen somebody with you've seen kids who are a little bit say spoiled, where their parents say stop doing that, and then do nothing about it, and then the kid does it again. The parent says stop doing that, and there's no escalation. There needs to be some escalation to incentivize a change in behavior. And that is currently what the penalty point system is handling. Right now, it is a very steep escalation curve. It's warning, 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 disqualification. But having disqualification on the table does serve as a very strong incentive for players who have made multiple mistakes. However, for the vast majority of cases, players are making innocent mistakes, and we're able to correct them and move on. And we don't want to punish these players harshly. And so we don't want to issue game losses or match losses or disqualifications for innocent mistakes, which is why we have penalty points. Penalty points are just a way to track the errors that a player has made over the course of a tournament. Most gameplay disruptions start at 1 penalty point and increment to 2 points when the infraction is repeated or commit a more severe infraction. Similarly, there are fractions that either escalate to 4 and 8 penalty points or begin at 4 or 8 penalty points depending on their severity. We also have tracking penalties. Tracking penalties are 0-point penalties. They never escalate. And those are to determine patterns of behavior. Those are if a player consistently lets their opponent miss triggers, or a player consistently lets their opponent make gameplay errors that are advantageous to the player. We want to be aware of that, because letting your opponent miss a trigger or two accidentally, that happens. Absolutely. You're not aware of your opponent's cards. You don't know what they do. Your opponent didn't tell them that they did something. Entirely reasonable that you miss that. You forget to include the +2/+2 for overwhelming barrage because it was in the discard pile, and you and your opponent both forgot it. Allowing your opponent to make mistakes, not something that you are allowed to consciously do, but it is very easy to unconsciously do. And so we do want to track it, but we don't want to escalate to disqualification automatically. We don't want it so that my actions can cause my opponent to receive a game loss or disqualification, because then I'm incentivized to do shady crap in order to get an advantage over my opponent. And we don't want players trying to dance on that line. So tracking penalties and 0-point penalties are there to make sure that we have that information to determine if there is a pattern. But we don't want to strongly penalize them. You can also, if you're ever feeling concerned about something, just go ahead, put in a penalty for that player. You don't have to tell them about it. And just say, hey, this is a tracking penalty. This is just something that I want to be aware of. Furthermore, talking about penalty points real fast. When you issue penalty points, the first time, the first 2 times, maybe even the first 3 times, if the player's under 5 penalty points, I would not talk to them about the escalation process, especially not in any detail. Saying something along the lines of, if this behavior repeats, the infraction penalty may escalate, is reasonable, but not really necessary. If you say, okay, so this penalty is worth 1 penalty point. If you repeat this infraction, it'll be 2. If you do a different class of infraction, that'll be at 1, unless it's more severe, in which case it'll be 2 or 4, depending on the severity of the infraction. If it's a tournament error, those generally start at 2 penalty points, and if at any point you accrue 10 penalty points, you're disqualified. The player will be like, look, now I'm super stressed out, and I don't understand what's happening. One of the challenges of the penalty point system is that it is not straightforward, given that everything has its own score, and almost everything has reasons to upgrade or downgrade the number of points that you're issuing. Players aren't going to have that internalized, and explaining that to them doesn't actually help their day. The information that they need is, if you do this a lot, it's bad for you. That's all they need to know. They don't need to know how bad. They don't need to know exactly how many times they need to do it at the beginning of the day. If somebody's on 8 penalty points, then going into a little bit more detail and telling them in detail at that point in time is more valuable. Starkiller07700, can you disagree a little bit? Some people may be surprised if they're told they have 5 points and makes them more stressed. Yeah, absolutely reasonable to disagree. The important part is, like, what I'm saying is don't tell them about penalty points and hide it until later. Absolutely not. What I'm saying is don't burden them with unnecessary technical detail. So starting with, hey, you're going to get some penalty points. It's nothing to worry about unless you make a habit out of it. Absolutely. That is the language that I use. Nothing to worry about unless you make a habit out of it. If you're going into the detail of, this is how many points you have, these are the exact, like, this is what the rest of your day looks like in minute detail and going over everything, I think that adds more burden. I may be wrong. This is definitely a case-by-case basis, and there are definitely players and individuals who do better with that information and prefer to have all of that detail. But in general, players are going to want the information of, I shouldn't do this anymore. If I do, it will escalate. And as you get closer to that escalation, giving more information so that they're not blindsided when they get to that endpoint if they do. However, I have not heard of any player being disqualified on penalty points. I'm sure that some have, but it's not something that I've heard of. But Yeah. So if a player says, "Can you explain more?" Absolutely give them more information. If a player looks confused or uncertain, absolutely give them more information. But the baseline is 99% of the time, in my experience, when I tell a player, "Hey, you're receiving a warning. It's nothing to worry about unless you make a habit out of it." They're like, "Great. Can I get back to my game now? I would like to play my game." And occasionally somebody's like, "What does that mean?" And at that point, I give them that information. But I think that it is important to not burden players too much with that information, but be ready to give it if they ask for it. Furthermore, when you're issuing a penalty, explain to them why they're receiving the penalty, like what infraction they committed. So this was a card manipulation error, or this was a gameplay disruption for missing a mandatory ability. Letting them know what they did wrong helps them solidify all that information in their head. If you just say you're getting penalty points, we're fixing it, we move on, the next time it happens, they're like, I don't know what I did wrong exactly. I know I did something wrong because the judge was involved. I knew that I made a mistake, but there's all these categories. There's missed mandatory ability, there's missed game step, there's inaccurate gameplay. What's the difference between those three? And some people aren't going to understand those differences. And again, some people this information is helpful, other people this information isn't helpful. I very much I put a lighter tone on things. For example, if a player draws an extra card, I'll say, "Hey, you're receiving a card manipulation error because you made an error manipulating your cards and put an extra card into your hand, which you're not allowed to do." And the player's like, "This is very clearly true." And having that explanation of the name of the error and what they did wrong, or like, "Hey, you're going to be receiving a warning for a missed mandatory ability because you didn't resolve the when played ability on your thing that has a when played ability, which you're not allowed to do." They're like, "You're correct. I'm not allowed to miss that. We should be fixing this. Good." That information, again, just makes them understand, yep, this is the thing that I did wrong. Here's the categorization if that information is useful for them, especially if a judge later is like, "Hey, have you committed any errors earlier today?" There's a chance that they'll remember, and it makes it a little bit easier for you as a judge. Part of what you'll want to do before you issue penalty points is, have you received any other warnings today? If so, what are they? The player's not going to be able to remember the classification. There's a chance, but they'll very often tell you, "Yes, I got this," and then they'll be wrong. The number of times a player's been like, "Yeah, I got a card manipulation error," and I look at the infraction history for that player, and it's like, "Yeah, this was a missed mandatory ability." I'm like, "Cool, this player does not know what's going on, but they do know that they got a warning." However, it's not going to escalate. So when a player tells you that they got a warning, trust them on that. Verify it. Even if they tell you that they don't, take a second to verify, but it's a lot easier. It saves you some time if they tell you that they have it and right. But very often they're going to have the category wrong, which matters for escalations. Notably, the head judge event, which will be you at planetary qualifiers. Very frequently, folks watching the stream are generally going to be a bit more enfranchised than other folks, but head judges have flexibility in how many points are issued for infractions, particularly gameplay disruptions, as those scale based on the severity of the infraction. It is also strongly recommended that points are reduced for non-behavior related infractions at casual tier events, and points are increased for behavior related infractions that occur on stream. Just because we care a little bit. It's not that we care less. It's that we focus more on education and remedy than on punishment at casual tier. And behavior problems are bad across the board. Being a jerk at casual tier or competitive tier is equally problematic. However, being a jerk on the internet, where it is the brand of the game, it is official or unofficial stream, that looks bad for the game, it looks bad for the store, it looks bad for the publisher. It's a worse look. Me being a jerk to my opponent, that is the two of us who are involved, and maybe our neighbors are like, there's one bad person. If you're a jerk on a stream and there are 100 people watching or 1,000 people watching, that has much more impact, and consequently the penalty points scale up for that. Next, we have game loss. Sometimes, although it is exceptionally rare, a game is irrecoverable and a game loss needs to be issued because we are unable to get close to restoring a natural game state. We are almost never going to be able to perfectly restore a game because some player will have gained information, because they now know that their opponent has this card in their hand, even if they know that they were likely to play it, or they know that the player was considering this attack. Like, if you attack a base when there's a sentinel in play, your opponent now and we rewind that, your opponent now knows, the player was is prioritizing my base over these units. That might have been obvious information, it might have been a lethal attack, or it might not have been obvious. It might be like, weird, why are they prioritizing my base? Does that mean that they have something like for a cause to close out the game? Do they have a way to prevent me from healing because I'm a heal heavy deck? That sort of thing. So even any illegal action, when we rewind it, is going to provide some information and result in a slightly corrupted game state. It's almost impossible to remove all corruption from a game. But we don't issue game losses for having some corruption. There's an amount of corruption that is viable. It's not something that I'm going to get into in detail in this lesson because it is so... we're going to talk about it a little bit more in the following lesson in gameplay disruptions, about how we fix things. Issuing a game loss for something like a gameplay disruption is a failure to fix the situation. It is not remedying the problem. Returning cards to hand, exhausting resources, readying resources, that sort of thing, that's remedying the game. Issuing a game loss doesn't remedy the game. It gets rid of the problem, but that's as much as cleaning your room is shoving everything into the closet or under your bed is cleaning your room. The problem wasn't resolved, and we don't get a natural outcome of the game. We also, in some cases, use game losses where the game itself hasn't been directly impacted. This is most frequently in the case of tardiness or deck and deck list errors. For tardiness, we issue game losses because it has an immediate impact on tournament progression. A player arriving multiple minutes late to their match is very likely to delay the tournament for all participants. They're getting a time extension for this time because their opponent is entitled to the full match of 25 or 55 minutes. But them being late simply does delay the tournament, and it's behavior that we want to strongly disincentivize. It's also important that, when a judge is making announcements starting the round, they'll be looking out and be like, all right, something that I do is, if you're still on your way to your seat, please raise your hand. And if I don't see any hands, as far as I can tell, everybody's in their seats. We're going to start that round. And if somebody shows up 2 or 3 minutes late, it's, how did you end up late where 100 other players, 500 other players, 2,000 other players were all able to make it to their seats on time? This is exceptional behavior and something that is almost entirely within your control. Deck and deck list problems fall into a somewhat similar category. Deck list errors only occur once during a tournament, and so there's not a chance for them to escalate. And so if it was a warning, there's no disincentive for having a deck list error in every single event because it will never escalate, and so it needs to be harsher than a warning, because once we see your deck list and we're like, you registered 46 cards, or you registered 4 copies of Greedo, or what have you, we fix that, and ideally we fix your entire deck list. We find all of the problems, we fix it once, we issue 1 game loss. You're not going to have another deck list problem, and so there's no world where that escalates on its own. Deck list problems and deck problems similarly, both of them are invisible to the opponent. With a gameplay disruption, card manipulation error, something like that, I make an error, my opponent has the opportunity to notice it, right? If I exhaust the incorrect number of resources, I attack a base instead of a sentinel, I choose an illegal target for an event. This is all public information, and my opponent has the opportunity, at the very least, to be like, that's not right, judge. Whereas with a deck list problem, my opponent doesn't get to see my deck list. They have no idea if it's legal or illegal. Similarly, most players aren't counting their opponent's decks, and even if they do, you're not going to catch failure to D-sideboard errors, where I swapped 3 cards out in the previous round and simply forgot to swap them back in. And so because the opponent can't verify, we want to be a little bit harsher here, because it is something that is very easy to get away with. If you notice it and your opponent's not going to, and so you can get away with it. And so we want to make it so that when it is caught, whether it be by a judge, opponent, it is harsher. Plus, these errors in decks and deck lists can provide significant advantage if committed intentionally. And so this all results in these errors not being, we can't fix the game, but it needs to be this harsh for long-term tournament integrity. Game losses are accounted for as part of the match result. If it's game 1, players proceed to game 2, with the player receiving the loss getting the choice of starting with the initiative. If it is game 2 and the player lost game 1, the match is now over. If they won, you proceed to game 3. If it's game 3, it ends the match. If a player is receiving a game loss before any game actions have been taken, again, likely due to tardiness or deck checks, at the beginning of the match, there's no sideboarding that occurs. The reasoning here is you don't know what information, you know nothing of your opponent's deck beyond leader and base. And so you have no real information to make sideboarding decisions on. And sometimes these game losses can happen before information like leader and base are revealed, particularly with tardiness. I show up on time. I have my leader and base out because I'm a good player. My opponent shows up late. They see my leader and base. They receive a tardiness game loss. Letting them sideboard would give them an unfair advantage over me, who was there on time. They know what deck they're playing against, and so we just want to avoid any sort of sideboarding issues. We also, it's part of the idea from the designers is that the deck that you bring, the 50 cards that you bring, is something that you chose to bring, and they want matches to have an unsideboarded game. This is unfortunate for decks that get stronger post-board if they lose their game 1s due to penalties, because it means that they are disadvantaged more than decks that have a little bit more flexibility. Decks that do really well in game 1s have an advantage, but this is just a cost of making this fairness in the system. Also, if both players receive game losses simultaneously, again, often due to deck checks or tardiness, the game losses offset, and players must still play their full best of 3 match, not a best of 1. And so if I show up late, my opponent shows up late, we're both going to get game losses, and we start with game 1, no sideboarding, we play 3. Match losses. Player loses a match. These are relatively rare, rarer than game losses, as they require an entire match to be disrupted to the point where it can't be completed. The most common case is tardiness or absence. Player just isn't there. We set this time at 10 minutes. 10 minutes is a pretty long time to have one player wait, and obviously we're not going to have a player sit there for 55 minutes waiting for an opponent who might never show up. Absence does appear most frequently at the back end of the tournament where players have worse records. This is frequently because a player drops or intended to drop and it just doesn't go through, either for technical reasons or they forgot about it, or they were going to mention to a judge, or they did mention it to a judge but the judge got distracted by tasks. Generally players should just be dropping themselves. It's easier than asking a judge. But if a player is absent from their match, in addition to receiving a match loss, they are dropped from an event. This is not a disqualification. Some players will call it a disqualification. It's not. They're simply dropped from the event because if you don't show up for your match, we assume that you no longer want to play any matches. However, if a player does say, hey, I had a medical emergency or a family emergency, I was out dealing with that, I was on the phone for work and was not able to make it to my round, but I would like to continue playing, we just add them back in, no problem, although the match loss stands. The other scenarios where match losses apply fall under unsporting conduct, unsporting behavior. One is forms of extreme outside assistance, where a player seeks out and receives information that makes it so that match integrity is lost. This is usually if a player seeks access to decklist information for their opponent's deck, like just looks at their opponent's deck list when they're not allowed to, or like tries to look at their opponent's deck, asks a spectator, hey, what's in their hand? Hey, how should I mulligan? Hey, how should I sideboard? Hey, what cards do I need to look at for in this matchup? That's all information that undermines the validity of that entire match. The other and more severe version is when one player's behavior makes it so that their opponent cannot be reasonably expected to play against them. This could be a player who is hostile and insulting to their opponent, but doesn't cross the line into major unsporting conduct. Even if a player has unintentionally slighted their opponent and they show remorse, the opponent might not be comfortable playing against them because whatever it was that they said or did was that uncomfortable or offensive. Now, if it is to the point where a player's like, I simply cannot be near this other person, that might be a sign that it falls under major, which does result in disqualification, even with remorse. But it's also possible that players like, look, I cannot play against this person. I've been deeply insulted. I understand that they didn't mean it maliciously. It's totally fine if they continue playing the event. I simply cannot play in this tournament. And you can issue a match loss there. This does need to be something that you're very careful with. You don't want players crying wolf and being like, hey, my opponent did something that insulted me deeply. I would like them to get a match loss. Players aren't going to do that. I've never seen a player try to weaponize this policy. And so there's a line between inappropriate behavior and harassment or hostile behavior. Harassment and hostile behavior results in disqualification. There's a line between inappropriate behavior being like, oh, you're a control player. That's not great, but we're not going to be disqualifying anybody over that. But like, potentially, like, there are a lot of slights, and I'm not going to say things on the internet that are bad, that could result in player just being like, hey, I don't feel comfortable playing this match. I'm going to be rattled the entire time. And we can remedy this by ending the match. Heroes app says, if they sit down and set the cards on the table and immediately forfeit, they get to sideboard. As long as a player has revealed their leader and base, yeah, you can concede and sideboard. If you show up, see your opponent's leader and base, and say, I want to go straight to game 2 because I have a terrible game 1, you do have to start the game in order to concede the game. You can concede the whole match without revealing your leader and base if you're like in contention for top 8 and you're hiding that information for whatever reason, and you're locked for top 8 even with a loss. But if you want to concede a single game, the game has to begin, and the way we begin the game is by revealing leader and base, and at that point you can concede. So you can't try and get an information edge by hiding some of that information. Finally, we get to disqualification, our most significant penalty that we as judges are issuing. Disqualification should only be reserved for the most severe infractions. Players should only be disqualified if they are cheating or for major forms of unsporting conduct, including crimes such as theft and assault. That's the line. If somebody is cheating or has done something so wildly inappropriate that they can no longer be in the event. Players making errors, innocent mistakes, should not be disqualified, generally speaking. Players who are disqualified from an event are removed from the tournament and are no longer allowed to participate in that specific tournament. This decision is a judge decision. You as the judge decide whether or not somebody, as the head judge, decides whether or not somebody's allowed to be in your event. The tournament organizer, however, who's in charge of the venue, can choose to eject the player from the venue or disallow the player from registering in other tournaments that weekend or at that venue. That is a tournament organizer decision. You can consult with the tournament organizer when deciding whether or not to disqualify. The tournament organizer can consult with you when determining whether or not to eject a player from the venue or ban them from the venue. There's more details in that in the disqualification FAQ lesson. That's a level 1 elective, I believe. We'll talk about it more in investigations. We're going to talk about this a lot because it is serious and important, and ideally never happens to you. Ideally, you never have to disqualify a player. It is one of the worst feelings in the world, because a lot of the time, some disqualifications are for players doing things that they kind of thought weren't great. The number of players I've disqualified for knowingly playing marked cards, but they're like, I didn't think they were that bad, so I played them anyway, even though it's a playset of the best card in my deck. It's like, so you're telling me that you knew that the best card in your deck was marked, and you played with it anyways. I don't know if you took advantage of it. I have no way of knowing. It's very hard to tell unless you tell me. But you have told me that you intentionally played marked cards. And they're like, I wasn't gonna. And I'm like, I probably believe you, but I can't have you playing in this event. And a lot of the times it's, do you feel like you don't have hard evidence? You know that the player made a mistake, but you don't have evidence of intent. And so a lot of the times you are just ruining somebody's day. Even if they are cheating, their day is worse, and it doesn't feel good to make somebody's day worse. They're very high conflict, which I don't love, but and a lot of players who cheat and are disqualified are not cheaters. A lot of players had a cheat of opportunity, or made a mistake and cover it up. A lot of my disqualifications are for something like, oh, I forgot to de-sideboard. I've realized I've made this error. If I call for a judge, I'm going to get a game loss. Instead of calling for a judge and getting a game loss, losing the match, I'm just going to not play this card. I won't gain an advantage by failing to de-sideboard by simply not playing the illegal card. And players try to self-correct, and then their opponent plays like Spark of Rebellion or something else and sees their hand, and they're like, hey, that's a weird card that is never in the main deck of this deck. Why is it in your deck right now? And it's discovered, yeah, this player did this on purpose to avoid a game loss or a more severe penalty. And they did something wrong. They did it on purpose. They gained an advantage. That advantage being avoiding a penalty. They aren't a cheater. They didn't come into the event planning to cheat. They just did it because they thought it was relatively minor. It was fine to cover it up. And disqualifying those players really sucks. I've disqualified players who were qualified for premier championship level events. And they're like, am I going to be able to play in that event? And I'm like, look, I think you made a mistake, and I think you tried to hide it. I don't think that you came into this with the intention to cheat. I don't believe that you're a malicious actor in this event. However, you did something that I can't allow in this event, so I am removing you from it. However, in my statement, I'm going to say that I don't believe that you're a malicious actor. I'm not the one who makes the suspension decisions, but part of my statement will say, I think that this person did this once, and this disqualification is going to make sure that they never do this again. As Loku667 says, it's important to tell players when they're disqualified, and that they're disqualified for cheating, but not call them a cheater. Being like, you are a cheater, that's a problem. That is personal attack. That is, we as judges want to remain unbiased, and saying you're a cheater isn't a great way to maintain a healthy relationship with players. So telling somebody that they did cheat, while it may feel like a semantic difference, is an important distinction to make. Right. So, player who's disqualified from a tournament is not eligible for any prizes they have not yet received, but it is allowed to keep any prizes or product they've already been given. If you disqualify a player in round 1, they get to keep the promo that they've been given. If you disqualify a player in top 8, if you gave out prize tickets or booster packs or something at the conclusion of Swiss based on Swiss standings, they get to keep those. Anything that you haven't given them, they're not eligible for. A player who's disqualified from a tournament should be reported to FFG along with their statement and the statements of the relevant parties. Again, this is all covered in the DQ FAQ lesson. A player can also be disqualified after the fact, but should be informed of their disqualification and be given the opportunity to submit a statement. So if you investigate a player, you have a call at a table, you investigate it, you determine that they're not cheating, and then a half hour later or a day later, like you're hanging out in the store and the player is also in your store and is like, yeah, I thought you caught me, but you didn't. Like, you didn't DQ me. And I was like, oh, thank goodness. You could just be like, okay, well, now that you've confessed, I'm going to retroactively disqualify you. This won't get rid of any prizes that they've earned, but if they had to, in the future when we have qualification points, they won't have those qualification points, invites that they've received, and they will be submitted for investigation by FFG. But if you're disqualifying a player after the event, if new information comes to light, one, you need to be very certain in this information. It is a lot more challenging to disqualify a player after the fact, because if you are disqualifying somebody face-to-face, you're able to talk to them, they're able to defend themselves. If you are disqualifying somebody after the fact because somebody sent you a video and you're like, I saw you did a thing, I'm going to DQ you, without having conversation, without genuinely investigating, going back and forth, it's a lot harder to defend your disqualification. And while you don't need to be 100% certain that somebody did cheat in order to disqualify them, you don't need hard evidence, it is important that you're able to defend that disqualification to the player, to the tournament organizer, and to FFG, because they are serious. Penalties other than warnings, other than just penalty points, should go through the head judge. Floor judges should absolutely never, ever issue disqualification, and should only issue game losses and match losses in the cases of tardiness and absences, which are exceptionally objectively measured penalties. Does the clock say 50 minutes? Does it say 45 minutes? Okay, that's the line. For deck problem and deck list problems, while the floor judge may issue the game loss, it is important to have the head judge involved for consistency. It's important to remain consistent because of the severity of these penalties. We want to ensure that the player receives the full attention of the head judge. Having the head judge on hand means that they can begin to de-escalate the situation and don't need to be brought up to speed. Also, game losses, particularly for in-progress games, are really hard to undo. If I say you lose and we pick up our cards, and then you're like, wait a second, can I appeal that? At this point, the game state is, like, if your cards are in a 50-card pile and your opponent's cards are in a 50-card pile, we're not going to be able to recreate that game state. Like, having the head judge there so that if there's an appeal on the game loss for an in-progress game, you're able to get that taken care of before you really ruin the game state. This is embarrassing story time. Years ago now, I issued a game loss for a deck list or a deck problem. Didn't consult with anybody. Definitely didn't consult with my head judge. Players were like, "Gotcha, judge. That sucks, but rules." And they pick up their cards. And then I go and let my head judge know what I did. I was just like, hey, by the way, I issued a game loss for this, blah, blah, blah. And my head judge looked at me like I'd grown a second head. And asked me a couple clarifying questions, and I was like, yep, this and this, and they're like, did you check this? And I'm like, oh, no, not at all. And they're like, well, that is a reason to not issue a game loss. Let's go back to that table. Head judge went back to the table, talked to the player. Turns out the reason to downgrade that game loss did apply to the game loss that I issued. And so the head judge was like, look, y'all have already picked up the game. We can't repair that game. What I can do is say you're playing game one again. While you're playing your second game of the match, this is game one. You will continue to play a best of three. Since game actions, this was a wild deviation, and it happened because a judge, myself, made a huge error. A deviation like this shouldn't happen. I'm not going to go into the details of the deviation because I don't want any of you to do it because it's wild and real bad. And hopefully none of you as floor judges or none of your floor judges as head judges issue game losses that are incorrect that you need to undo. So, going to take a minute to breathe as we finish lesson 12. Oh yeah, I knew there was no world I was going to get through 5 lessons. I don't think there's a world where I get through 3. I think I can do another one. I think I can do another 1, maybe, and that's going to push me. But... Alright, do we have any questions before I move on to gameplay disruptions? Do we have any questions on penalties? Starkiller, yeah, it's me getting, like, nerd sniped by chat happens very frequently, and I just look over here and I'm like, oh, reading this. Loku, what do you mean you don't want me to deviate anymore? I don't want you to deviate as wildly as this head judge deviated, because ideally you don't have floor judges issuing game losses when they shouldn't. Here it says, stop talking about Lego. I have barely, and I'm planning on packing all this up soon. I don't know if you can see the boxes and the mess in my background. It looks fine to me, but there's a lot of mess back there, and it's all going to go into nice little boxes, and it'll go someplace else along with me. But all right, on to lesson 13 at the 52-minute mark. That'll be fine. We'll call this a 2-hour broadcast. So, let's talk about gameplay disruptions. We're going to be talking about missed mandatory abilities, missed game steps, and inaccurate gameplay. Card manipulation error is a gameplay disruption. It's currently classified as a tournament error. It's going to be reclassified, and so I'm going to teach it as though it's reclassified already. But we're gonna take the tangent that's thrown at us. Starkiller asks, most used initiative token? That would be my medal initiative token. I happened to be in office when they got them in, and so I have one of the initiative tokens. I haven't used it a lot, but it's the one that I've used most recently. Mightstone says, have a meeting before the tournament and let your floor judges know what your powers are and when to call more judges. Yep, 100% always at the beginning of every event I have. Ideally in pre-event briefings and an at-event briefing, I include when you should be consulting with another judge. Game losses and up, you want to talk to head judge, appeals, investigation, head judge. For rewinds, whether or not to rewind, even if you think I don't want to rewind this, reversing decisions and card manipulation errors, these are all things that can change information in a game. I generally say check with senior judges. A lot of the time this is overlapping with my team leads. And then on every other call, it's if you're not 100% certain, just grab another judge and double check. The extra minute or two it takes doesn't hinder tournament progression and does result in a better player experience. Oh boy, Loku says, I had a floor judge deviate and not issue a game loss, then get me and tell me that they only gave a warning, because if I want to give a game loss, it doesn't waste that much time. Yep. Would prefer if you're talking about a game loss, if you're talking about any of these things that requires a consultation, if you're thinking about it, even if the answer might be no, get somebody involved who can answer yes or no firmly. A game loss that is not issued that should be is as disruptive. And we can always issue a game loss later. It's not as disruptive as a game loss that is issued that shouldn't be. but it is very disruptive, especially if it doesn't go noticed. I'll show off the medal initiative token at the end of the broadcast if I can find it quickly. It's somewhere in here, and I've started packing for a move, and so it might be packed up. I don't think it is, but oh yeah, like if you're consulting, if you are taking a judge call and you are consulting on that judge call, as Loku says, tell the players to pause. Tell the players do not continue to play, because if they do, things will go off track so quickly. Similarly, this is why it's a best practice for spectators. If they see something go wrong in the game, stay at the match, call a judge, and then the players go, hey, why are you calling a judge on us? Did we do something wrong? And then they look at the board and they're like, oh, we missed a thing. Yeah, judge, please help us. Here's that asks, are you moving to Minnesota? No, I'm not moving to Minnesota, just moving within Massachusetts. My lease is up at the end of the month, so I go to Vegas for a TCG event, move, come back, go to Vegas for a TCG event, and then finally get to be home in August. But moving within Massachusetts, not to Minnesota. Minnesota's too cold for me in the winter. It gets real cold there. Anyways, gameplay disruptions are like chat disruptions, where I go off on a tangent. Alright. So, gameplay disruptions are aptly named. They are when a player's actions disrupt the natural and accurate flow of the game. That's a gameplay disruption. This is generally caused by players messing up the execution of an action or being unaware of game rules to the fullest extent. If you believe that the actions are intentional, you should get the head judge, like we were just talking about. And the head judge should proceed with an investigation. We're going to cover that in future level 2 lesson. This lesson's only about things where we're like, nah, this doesn't spark my spidey sense at all. Or we have investigated and determined that there is no cheating. As a basic practice, as a best practice, something that I encourage every single one of you to do on every single judge call you take is ask yourself, hey, why is this not cheating? Don't assume that the player is guilty. We assume that players are innocent. However, a good practice to get into your mind is, what reasons do I have for considering this error, this line of play, to not be cheating? Sometimes it's very obvious, like the player forgot to draw cards and they have 20 cards left in their deck, so they're not worried, like they're not it's an aggro mirror, there's no risk of decking out. There is absolutely no advantage to be gained by missing a card draw here, not cheating. Or a player missed their restore trigger and didn't heal their base. They're at 29 out of 30 and they're remaining, and their opponent's at like 3 out of 30. Probably not going to impact the match. They're probably not doing that to gain an advantage. There can even be things that are visibly disadvantageous, where it's very easy to be like, oh, this probably isn't cheating. This doesn't make any sense for it to be cheating. And you can take into account the round placement. Like, if a classic, I want to play, I don't know, Phase 3 Dark Trooper. And instead, I exhaust my 3 resources. Sorry, I've been so good at using the right terms. I exhaust my 3 resources, and I play Darth Vader commanding the First Legion. My opponent doesn't notice. I blank and don't resolve either of its triggered abilities. I just think, yeah, this is my 3/3 Sentinel. And then my pass and my opponent takes an action, and then I go to ready. I'm like, wait a second. How do I have a Vader in play? This is probably not cheating, because playing a Vader for 3 resources on round 2 is extraordinarily obvious. The first time your opponent goes to attack with it, the first time you go to attack with it, unless you sit there and both of you do nothing for another 4 or 5 rounds, it's going to be extraordinarily obvious that something has gone wrong. And so that's probably not cheating. Now, playing Vader for 6 resources, you have a little bit more concern. But maybe it's their opponent had just resolved the DJ, and so it makes sense that the player thought that they were on 7 resources, because they were on 7 resources until their opponent took one. That explains why it's not cheating. And so just as a best practice, why isn't this cheating? Most of the time it's going to be, oh, because it disadvantages the player to do this. Or, oh, because there's, like, the risk here is huge because it's super obvious and the gain is minimal. Or it doesn't matter, the player is actually, like, the player actually has lethal in play, just could have attacked and won the game. I don't know why they're playing more cards. Or like, oh, a player forgot to defeat a resource off Han, but they haven't used that resource and they're called, like, they just didn't use the resource throughout the entire round. They didn't really gain an advantage from it. They called attention to it themselves. Probably not cheating. That question of why isn't this cheating should always be in the back of your mind. It'll help you get better at detecting cheating. Ask one or two questions of how did this happen? And that'll help you get a lot better with that. ST77M is their application form to the Gen Con judges. That is being handled by ACES. I believe that application process is complete, however, and staffing selection has been done, but I'm honestly not sure. I'm not working that event, and so I don't know if acceptances have gone out for that. I would recommend checking the ACES Discord to see what you can find out about Gen Con. So, going back to gameplay disruptions, assuming no malicious intent, no cheating. When a gameplay disruption has occurred, it is our responsibility as judges to remedy the situation as best as possible and get the game as close as we can to a natural game state, as though the error had not occurred. As I previously mentioned, we're never going to be able to do that. Information has been gained, actions have been taken, somebody knows something they didn't, cards have been revealed, cards have changed zones. We're so rarely going to be able to perfectly fix things. Like, there are some cases where we can, but the vast majority of the time it's not going to be a perfect fix, and that's okay. So, we have a few fundamental remedies. We have several tools that we can use here. First is known as Resolve Now. This isn't using the phrase resolve as the comprehensive rules do, as it can be used to address errors that aren't resolving cards or abilities. For example, if an incorrect amount of damage was marked on a unit that was attacked, adding the appropriate number of counters isn't resolving an ability, but it fits under the Resolve Now umbrella. Second is rewinding or backing up. This is where the judge works with the player to determine everything that has happened since the error, and then works with the players to undo all of those actions so that the game is back to the state it was in before the error was committed. Then play resumes, which means players are allowed to make different decisions, which means that rewinds and backups can be somewhat disruptive to the game. This is both a restriction that makes rewinding difficult, but also a feature in that it can allow games to play out more naturally. An example I love to give is that if you forget to put an experience token on a unit, it is relatively easy most of the time to be like, oh, let's put an extra experience on that. We have entirely solved the problem. However, if, let's say that unit is a 2-3, we forget to put the experience on it, we go to my turn, I attack that unit with a 3-3, and then we realize, wait a second, that unit should have an experience token on it. Resolving Now does fix the issue. It now has an experience token on it, but it leads to an unnatural game state. I probably wouldn't have attacked a 3-4 with a 3-3 like I would have a 2-3. And so a rewind there allows me, the player who didn't make the error, to make a choice that I would have made had the game state been in the correct place. Finally, judges can leave the game state as is. In rare circumstances, both Resolving Now or rewinding to the point of error can be more disruptive to the game state than simply continuing to play without performing any remedy. Leaving the game as is should not be common, and judges should strive to find solutions that address the underlying issues through either Resolving Now or rewinding. If of the four options, Resolve Now, Rewind, Leave as is, ending the game is less disruptive than those, you can issue a game loss. This effectively, when you're doing that though, what you're saying is this error made it so the incorrect player would win the game. and therefore we are remedying this by issuing a game loss. That shouldn't happen most of the time. Resolving, rewinding, or leaving as is will ideally lead to better game states. Starkiller asks, is there a mid option like resolve some and leave the rest? Currently, no. Part of the issue with that is because one of our goals with policy, as we discussed earlier, is to have consistent enforcement. When a player makes an error, we want the player to know how it's going to be fixed, how it's going to be addressed, right? And the more freedom we give judges, the more flexibility judges have in their rulings, the less consistency we have. Right now, our options are resolve now, rewind, leave as is, game loss. We're talking about digging deeper into fixes, having a list of fixes that should generally always be resolved now. Stuff like putting on damage, putting on tokens, drawing cards. Those can all generally just be fixed and wholly resolve the issue if that's the whole thing. There's also a world where we talk about, this is talking about the future and not real policy at the moment, allowing a simple backup before resolve now. So undo the most recent thing and then resolve now. So for the example of the attack, we undo the attack, then put the token on, and then proceed with the game. That is not currently a prescribed fix per policy, but that is something that I would like to see included in policy. That gives us a nice middle ground of a player just made an action based on an incorrect game state. Can we undo that action, correct the game state, and move on? That gives us a lot more freedom. That lets us fix a lot of things, because as we get into talking about backing up, there's some situations where it is near impossible to rewind just because of what has happened with the game. Mightson says, do we resolve up to 3 as 0 if missed? This is an issue in the pending rules section. Right, okay. So this is a question about how to handle missing a restore trigger. I believe the example is you have 2 damage marked on base. You have a restore 3 trigger. You forget the trigger. Damage is then dealt to your base, and then you're like, wait a second, I had my restore trigger. This would be a great place for the hybrid system of undo the attack, resolve the restore, proceed with the game. If you can also consider rewinding, because that fixes things more naturally. I believe there isn't policy right now that covers this, and so this isn't official policy, but again, we're in season 0, and so judges are encouraged to come up with fixes that fix the game, and then report those fixes if they deviate from policy. But saying you're only allowed to make choices that would have been legal at the time the trigger should have resolved is a reasonable fix, and one that I've seen other card games do. Or you're only allowed to do things up to the amount that, like, we treat it as it was resolving. So, like, we'll put the trigger back in time, but we're not going to move any of the rest of the game. That is a possibility. This is also known as, like, a rewind fast forward, where we say, hey, we're going to rewind to the point of error, resolve this correctly, and then fast forward to the present moment in time. However, saying that this is what we do all of the time can be dangerous, because sometimes a player's like, I would have made different decisions if I had known that they had a full health base as opposed to this slightly damaged base, right? And so fixing stuff now can cause as much issues as rewinding and fixing them, because a player was operating with incorrect information. So I don't believe an up to is treated the same as a May trigger. That's something that is I believe also a pending clarification that we don't have clarification on. Right now, my understanding is May triggers are May triggers. Up to are not considered optional, and you do have to remind your opponent of them. And while you do get the choice, does restore say up to? I'm curious now. I can't type. We're just tangenting here. Restore doesn't say up to. You just restore that much. That one's definitely weird. And you could, I believe right now, it would be a deviation to say, no, you only restore 2, you do not get to restore 3. However, I also think that that is something that I would like to see incorporated in policy. Talking about policy is very difficult because policy as it stands is undergoing a lot of growth, and I just spent a week talking about what policy will be like in the fall, if not this summer. But that is not what policy is now. And so being like, hey, there's a hole in policy, I'm like, yeah, that is something that I'm aware of. That hole's going to continue to exist until it gets updated in the future. That's why I have the disclaimer at the top of all of these lessons being like, hey, policy can and will change, and these lessons can and will change. But to answer right now, my interpretation of policy is you would get the full heal 3. However, I also think that it is a reasonable deviation to only heal 2. Yes, it is a deviation, and doing so, you should report it to FFG. And also let me know so I have data, because I like having data. Alright, so, resolving now. As mentioned, resolving now can handle a lot of errors that crop up. If damage is incorrectly marked, adding or removing counters can address the issue. If a card should have changed zones but didn't, we can just move it now, and that often fixes the issue. If incorrect number of resources were exhausted to play a card, exhausting or readying additional resources as appropriate can handle the situation. If a trigger was missed, just being like, yep, we're going to do that now, can also fix things. However, changing the game state in the middle of a player's action can make it so that what was a good decision is no longer a good decision, and we don't want it so that I can make a mistake, my opponent makes a decision, I realize my mistake, and my opponent gets punished, essentially, for my mistake. That's something that we want to avoid, and so that's, if a player would want to change their decisions based on resolving now, that's a good indicator that you want to consider potentially rewinding. You also want to make sure that you're wholly addressing the error with a resolve now. If the issue was you forgot to resolve a trigger that says put a counter experience token on a unit, and has since attacked with that unit, you may also need to add damage to whatever that unit attacked, and things begin to get a little bit more complicated. And so if you're doing more than one thing, that's again another indicator that you should potentially consider rewinding instead of resolving now. We're going to take a full lesson on backing up. That's lesson 14, and given that I've been here for an hour and 12 and I'm like a third of the way through this lesson, that's going to be on our next broadcast. But we're going to talk a lot more about backing up in the future. So, let's go through a quick example, and we can go into more depth in a future one. Backing up means undoing everything that has happened since the error, and then letting the game proceed from there. Let's say a player attacked a base with a sentinel in play, then the non-active player attacked back, an event was played defeating a unit, initiative claimed, and then the game proceeds to regroup, and it's not until after regroup that the active player realizes that their opponent had a sentinel in play. The rewind here would be as follows. Both players exhaust resources until they're in the state they were at the end of the regroup phase, because we want to ensure that players have access to the correct resources during the round. Both players select a resource at random from their resource zone and return it to their hand, assuming both players played a card as a resource. We select a card at random because the identities of the cards chosen were hidden information, and we have no way of confirming what cards had been played this phase, and we're not going to let players pick a card, because while we trust players not to be cheaters, we don't want to create big old windows of opportunity for them to crawl through and be like, oh, this Avenger that I resourced on turn or on round 1, that's going to be back in my hand now. Then both players take 2 cards at random from their hand and put them on top of their deck. We do not shuffle them in. Again, we select random cards because we can't confirm which cards were drawn. The cards are placed on top of the deck and not shuffled because the cards may be cards that the players had in their hand since the beginning of the game, and these cards were drawn legally. We don't need to fix the card draw. We need to fix something else, and this card draw being undone is a casualty of that fix. Shuffling them away is very disruptive, especially if they're cards that the player had in their hand from the beginning of the game and sculpted their gameplay around having. And the players will, in relatively short order, draw these cards back when we go back through the normal timeline. And so they're not going to be missing these cards. They didn't play these cards this round. And so they are unlikely to have wanted to play them this round, although not necessarily. And they're going to have them back at the end of the round. And so it is relatively small disruption to put them on top of the deck, but it is still some disruption. The initiative is unclaimed and returns to the player who previously had it. The event that was played is unplayed, returned to its owner's hand, and the appropriate resources are readied, and any effects of that event are undone. The unit that the non-active player attacked with is readied, and damage is removed from it and the target of the attack. If any triggers were resolved as a consequence of the attack, they're undone as well. The unit that the active player attacked with is readied, damage removed from it and the base. Then the game resumes with the active player taking their action, which may or may not be an attack. They might be like, okay, yeah, I'll just attack your sentinel. Or they'll be like, I'm going to do something completely different here. They might claim the initiative. Who's to say? Now, there are many reasons why you wouldn't want to perform this rewind. One, cards are taken from resource and returned to hand. This could give a player a late game card that they resourced early and shouldn't have access to at this point in time. The counterpoint is, let's say this is the deck that made the illegal attack is a Sabine deck, and the attack brings their opponent down to 1. That makes it so they go, ready, activate Sabine, you lose. And that's pretty damaging. So fixing that attack is very high in importance, and so we're willing to have a little bit more, like, if we're able to get to a more natural game state through rewinding, that is something that is generally worth doing, even if there is some corruption still left in the game. Cards are taken from the player's hand and temporarily returned to the deck. While the player will draw those cards as mentioned as part of the regroup phase, they may lose access to cards that they've had for a long portion of the game, and similarly may gain access to cards that they shouldn't have had a bit earlier than they should have because they drew 2 cards from their deck. It also gets very difficult if players have access to search or shuffle effects. If the 2 cards that were put back are cards that you don't really want, now's maybe a great time to play that U-Wing reinforcement and throw those bad cards onto the bottom of your deck. Or use a search your feelings and shuffle the deck and get them out of there. An event was revealed from the active player's hand. That's information that the non-active player didn't have when they made their attack, which might change their decisions. The decisions around the attacks was also revealed information. And so we have a lot of random stuff happening. These fixes are random, not great. We're not going to be able to have the game play out exactly the way it should have. And information was revealed. But that information was only detrimental to the player who made the mistake, and we're okay with the non-active player, the player who didn't make the mistake, gaining a small advantage from the fix when the other player made the mistake, as long as that advantage is less significant than the disruption of the error itself. That's like, if one player is going to walk away advantage from an error occurring, we would rather it be the player who didn't make the mistake than the player who did, because that would incentivize players to make mistakes, and we don't want that. It also incentivizes players to call for a judge, because they might end up with a slight advantage as opposed to a slight disadvantage. The impact of the rewind also changes depending on where we are in the game. If this is round 1 or 2, and that life, while it has an impact, doesn't immediately determine the outcome of the game, it might be less disruptive to leave as is. Whereas in the end game, that might change who wins the game and is very disruptive, and so having a slightly more disruptive fix is more tolerable. But you can see with just this one example why we're going to spend a little bit more time discussing backups and rewinds in a future lesson. I say future lesson as though it didn't come out like 2 weeks ago. Um, if you're considering rewinding through cards going from one hidden zone to another, deck, hand, and resource, that random factor is a good reason to consider not rewinding. However, keep in mind that cards put back in the deck during rewinds are put back on top of the deck, and so your players are likely to access them very quickly. Then again, like, if I put a card on top of my deck because we're undoing a card draw, and I have something that I can smuggle out, I can get the card that was in my hand that I didn't want my hand, and running that into my resources where I'd like it to be because I would have just resourced it anyways, and now I can dig one card deeper, and again, rewinds could get real spicy. Here's that. No, not today. Not going to do 5 today. 5 is too many. Alright. So we've talked about resolve now. We've talked about backing up. Let's bring us to door number 3, leave as is. In the above situation for the illegal attack with the unit attacking the base instead of the sentinel, resolve now doesn't really make sense. There's nothing to do now. We're not going to hand wave the attack and say, you actually attack the sentinel, let's add damage to your unit, the sentinel, and remove it from the base. We're not holding players to illegal plays or making them make decisions. We don't force players to make decisions because we want to test the player's skills, and if the player if the player wasn't going to make that decision, we're not going to swoop in and say, you're going to make a bad decision because I think you should. Not only is that not a choice the player would have made, but the choices that came after, the attack from the non-active player, playing the event, these may have been made very differently if the player had attacked the sentinel. We've also discussed why the situation isn't a great candidate for a rewind. If you decide not to rewind, we still haven't resolved it. We don't have a fix. When neither rewinding or resolving now look good, a judge should consider leaving the game as is. It may feel uncomfortable to not address the game, but it's important to remember that it is shared responsibility of both players to ensure that the game state is accurate. The non-active player could have and should have pointed out that they had a sentinel you didn't play and that the attack was illegal at the time of the attack. When you're like, oh, this feels bad, just be like, did the other player have a reasonable chance to point this out? Did the other player have a hand in causing this error? If a player played Regional Governor, named Super Laser Blast, then I play Super Laser Blast, and my opponent's like, yeah, that is entirely fine and resolves without issue, and then later it's like, wait a second, you shouldn't have been able to play the Super Laser Blast. It was your card that said that I shouldn't play. I definitely did something wrong. I should absolutely get a penalty for playing Super Laser Blast illegally. However, my opponent also should have been aware that I shouldn't have been playing Super Laser Blast. Because that's more obviously illegal than, say, me missing a trigger on my own card because you don't necessarily know my triggers. So let's talk about how you determine the fix. Sometimes the fix is going to be clear and obvious. You're just going to be like, oh yeah, put a counter on that. Oh yeah, put a damage on that. Oh yeah, put that back in your hand, unexhaust those resources, you're all set, go back to your game. However, you're going to use your judgment. You're going to determine which fix is best for the situation. Games are going to be inconsistent, or fixes are going to be inconsistent of this. I'm definitely going to take some time to do some level 2 electives, or possibly end of L2 track example lessons where I just throw a bunch of policy examples out there, talk about infractions, penalties, and fix, just to drill folks on that. When fixing an error, what you don't want to do is begin by determining the fix, and then figuring out which infraction offers you that fix. Determine what went wrong, which will tell you which infraction the player committed, and from there, determine the fix as per policy. Furthermore, the remedy is not supposed to be punitive. The entire purpose of the remedy is to get the game back on track and mitigate advantage gained or potential advantage gained from making the error. The penalty itself, which is what we discussed previously, is the only aspect of the infraction that should be punitive at all. Don't pick a fix because it is disadvantageous to the player who made the error and you feel that they need to be punished. However, you can take into account which player is disadvantaged more by your remedy. If rewinding provides a slight disadvantage to the player who committed the error, but resolving now provides a slight disadvantage to their opponent, leaning in favor of mitigating the advantage towards the player who made the error is a better practice than giving that player an advantage. Alright, applying the remedy. Once you figured out what you're going to do, explain it to both players, but don't have them do anything. Anytime you're explaining a fix to players, be like, I'm going to explain the fix. Please don't do anything. Don't move cards, don't reveal cards, don't do anything. Because they're gonna, and that, if they do it wrong, or they want to appeal, they don't like your ruling, they give you information that changes your ruling, we don't want to have begun the process and caused more disruption. It does really suck when you're a judge, you're at a table, you're trying to fix things, and you end up making things worse temporarily. That's just awkward for everybody involved. So, what you do is you walk through the entire thing, make sure both players are on board. Players may also give you more information while you're providing the fix, and that changes your ruling. So, take your time, explain to both players, ensure that they understand what the fix is and why you're applying it, and that none of them have anything to add, and they're both satisfied with the outcome as possible. Then, once we're all on the same page, we go back to the start of the explanation and go through the process a second time. This time with the players taking the actions. You absolutely want to stay and oversee the fix. You're not going to tell them what to do and then walk away, because they will screw it up. Not all the time, but enough that you should stay and make sure things happen correctly. Furthermore, if something does go wrong, you're there to immediately correct it. If a player accidentally draws a card that they're not supposed to because they thought they were supposed to, you can be like, hold on, I saw you draw that card. We don't need to go to a card manipulation error or anything like that. This is much more resolvable with a third-party, unbiased individual here. So, watch them do it. Walk them through it. Once they're done, say, okay, we're good. Continue playing your game. Good luck, have fun. I'll get out of here and do some paperwork. Now, there are 3 categories of gameplay disruptions. Missed mandatory actions, missed mandatory game steps, and inaccurate gameplay. Missed mandatory actions is a broad category that covers missing any ability entirely, missing a part of ability, or when ability is resolved when it shouldn't. This will most frequently be a player missing triggers when played, when defeated on attack, or resolving them when they shouldn't. A lot of the time, if they're caught quickly, missed mandatory actions are good candidates for resolving now. You can just put an experience token on something or deal a point of damage. Missed game steps are when a player misses something laid out in the comprehensive rules that applies to game structure. Generally, the 2 big ones are readying resources and drawing cards for regroup. Those are relatively straightforward. Inaccurate gameplay is another very broad category. Resolving something at the correct time but resolving it incorrectly, or resolving it at the incorrect time but resolving it correctly, can be inaccurate gameplay. Examples include paying the incorrect cost for a card, making an illegal attack, or claiming the initiative when another player has already done so. Inaccurate gameplay is frequently going to be best resolved with a rewind if a couple of things have happened. If a player's action or choice is illegal, they need to make a new choice. They need to make a legal choice. And that shouldn't happen out of sequence. It should occur when they were supposed to take the action. Card manipulation errors. This is when a player looks at cards that they shouldn't, draws cards when they shouldn't. These are also gameplay disruptions. However, because they involve an error involving hidden information by their very nature, they generally don't fall into situations where resolving now or rewinding are practical solutions. And so we're going to have a whole lesson on those after we talk about backups, so that'll probably be Tuesday. Repeated infractions. If a player repeats the infraction, the severity of the penalty escalates from 1 penalty point to 2. It doesn't need to be the exact same infraction. A player who misses a trigger, a missed mandatory ability, can receive a second missed mandatory ability for not drawing a card off of Heroic Sacrifice, which would upgrade to 2 penalty points. These are both missed mandatory abilities, and so even though it's not the exact same thing, it does upgrade. However, not drawing a card for the regroup phase is not a missed mandatory ability, it's a missed game step, which would have its own upgrade track. It's important to always look at the root cause and what actually happened and what is the thing that went wrong, because that's the thing that you need to fix. We aren't issuing multiple penalties, especially for legally completing actions that are based on an illegal action. If I make an illegal attack, and then legally resolve on attack triggers, I'm not going to get penalized for resolving those triggers. That didn't happen incorrectly. The attack was illegal. That's what we need to fix. We do probably want to undo that on attack trigger, so we probably rewind it, but we look at the root cause, the thing that went wrong first. For example, active player plays mission briefing for 2 resources instead of 3. That's illegal. However, the cards that they drew were legal. Once you played mission briefing, once it goes to resolve, you're supposed to draw 2 cards. Once the player had played the card, resolving the card is the correct and legal thing to do. In a similar way, as I was just saying, like, if we make an illegal attack, resolve an on-attack trigger, or when defeated trigger occurs, players should not be infracted for these later actions. They occurred legally, even though the root cause was illegal. If a player commits multiple infractions in a batch of actions, we focus on the first thing that went wrong and don't issue multiple penalties. For example, a player makes an illegal attack and then forgets to resolve an on-attack trigger. We'd most likely just rewind the attack and issue a minor gameplay disruption, not 1 inaccurate gameplay and 1 missed mandatory ability. We also discussed earlier in Leave As Is the idea that both players are responsible for infractions that occur, which can be taken into account when applying remedies and using our judgment to best rectify the situation. It's also taken into account when issuing penalties. We want to be aware that when a player doesn't catch an infraction immediately for their opponent's error, we want to know that. We just want to keep an eye on things. A player allowing their opponent to take an illegal action that advantages the player falls into the same category of cheating as that player taking an illegal action themselves and not calling a judge. That is to say, if a player is aware that the game state is illegal, gained an advantage from it, and knew that they were not allowed to ignore it, and chooses to ignore it anyways, that player should be investigated for cheating. Because this is a potentially serious infraction, if a player commits an error and their opponent doesn't say anything, we want to make note of it. Doesn't say anything immediately. Like if I go attack your base and I say, hold on, I have a sentinel, we're not going to be issuing a tracking penalty. They pointed it out at the first opportunity. They can't point it out before their opponent declares the attack. Similarly, if they go attack your base and then I go, okay, cool, I'm going to play an event. Wait, I have a sentinel. We can't do this. Again, the player pointed it out before they resolved their next action. That is soon enough that we could be like, this is not something where we're going to be tracking this as much because you're pointing it out relatively quickly and not letting the game state become corrupted. If a player doesn't notice the issue or the error is disadvantageous to them, it is not possible for it to be cheating, but you do want to make a note of it anyway. Sometimes, however, the player is responsible for the game rule that their opponent broke, with cards like Regional Governor, which says their opponent can't play a card of a specific name, or Sentinels, which govern which attacks are legal. That player now has an active role in the error being made. Consequently, if a player controls an object that is creating a game rule that their opponent broke, they receive a warning penalty and 1 penalty point, which escalates per usual. So we treat it like a full gameplay disruption, not a tracking penalty. Reason behind this is twofold. 1, it's hard to expect their opponents to be aware of every game rule modifying effect on another player's cards. And second, we don't want to incentivize players to let their opponents miss card-generated game rules. If these penalties didn't escalate, a malicious player could play Kira and Regional Governor, Wolf, Tridroid Fighter, and be like have their opponents run into Restore 3 and be like, I'm going to wait a second and point out my Wolf and say, hey, you're not supposed to gain life. You're going to get warning. Oh, you're going to get another warning. Oh, you're going to get disqualified. If we make it reciprocal, if your opponent breaks a game rule because of one of your cards and you get the same points, this strongly disincentivizes the player from trying to gotcha their opponents with all of this. That is all for this lesson. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them my way. Thank you all for joining me. Mad Dog Max says, I would love to see some scenarios for cheating investigations we could study. That is on the syllabus. Let me pull up my syllabus real fast. We're currently on lesson 16. Let me see if I can change these bullet points to numbers. So we're currently on lesson 16. I currently have... Oh boy, that's wrong. Currently have lesson 19 slated as Investigations 101. Lesson 20 is Card Counts 101. And 21 as Disqualifications 101. And so I'm going to try and have some practical situations and philosophy on investigations there. Talk about things like collateral truths, and figuring out risk and reward, understanding strategy, asking the right questions, that sort of stuff. There's going to be more investigations content in level 3 stuff, but there is going to absolutely be some investigations content in upcoming lessons. With all that, I'm not seeing any more questions. I've been talking for an hour and a half and my voice is starting to go. So I will see you all on Tuesday when we cover lessons 14 and 15, which are backing up and card manipulation errors. And then I guess Friday will be 16, 17 for deck lists and deck checks and mark cards. That's a good combo. And then the following Tuesday, I think we'll be able to catch up to real time. Just in time for me to leave for an event and fall behind. Anyways, thank you all so much for joining me. I'll see you in the next one. Good luck and have fun.